They trusted the NHS to heal them, but instead, patients were given contaminated blood. Lives shattered, families destroyed, and a nation left questioning its healthcare system. Between 1970 and the early 1990s, thousands of innocent patients were infected with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood products. During the height of the contaminated blood scandal, a significant portion of the blood products imported into the UK from the USA came from an unlikely and troubling source: prisons. The Infected Blood Inquiry's findings highlight systemic and individual failures across various levels of government, healthcare professionals, and pharmaceutical companies. Holding these entities accountable is essential for justice and for deterring future negligence. In this video, Audit Oblivion investigates a hidden tragedy spanning decades and claiming over 3,000 lives. How did the UK's National Health Service become the unwitting accomplice in one of the deadliest healthcare disasters of our time? Join us as we unravel the facts behind the infected blood scandal. We will highlight the failures and negligence that led to this catastrophe. Chapter 1. History of blood transfusion. Practice of blood transfusion has a long and complex history, evolving significantly over the centuries. In the United Kingdom, the development and organization of blood transfusion services have been particularly shaped by the needs of both civilian and military medical care. The first successful blood transfusions date back to the 19th century. In 1818, Dr. James Blundell performed the first documented human-to-human transfusion to treat postpartum hemorrhage. This marked the beginning of a new era in medical science. However, these early transfusions were direct and had to be performed immediately to prevent coagulation. Two major advancements in the early 20th century revolutionized blood transfusion. In 1901, Dr. Karl Landsteiner discovered blood groups, which drastically reduced the risks associated with transfusions. Later, the use of sodium citrate as an anticoagulant, discovered in 1914, enabled the storage of blood and paved the way for indirect transfusions, allowing blood to be stored and used when needed. The World Wars accelerated the development of blood transfusion services. During World War I, indirect transfusions became more common, and the importance of plasma in treating shock was recognized. The interwar period saw the establishment of the first blood banks, notably by Dr. Frederic Durand-Jorda during the Spanish Civil War. His methods were later adopted in the UK. By the start of World War II, blood transfusion services had become more organized. The National Blood Transfusion Service, NBTS, was created in England and Wales in 1946, marking the establishment of a coordinated effort to manage blood supplies on a national level. This system was managed directly by the Ministry of Health and later transferred to regional hospital boards. Advancements included the development of freeze-dried plasma, which improved the storage and transport of blood products. This was crucial for both civilian and military applications. The 1960s saw further innovations with the introduction of plastic blood bags and improved fractionation techniques, enhancing the safety and efficiency of blood transfusions.
I'm the manager of a savings bank with branches all over the country, but we are by no means an ordinary savings bank. In fact, our vaults contain something much more valuable. They contain flasks of life-giving blood and plasma.
Despite these advancements, the UK struggled with self-sufficiency in blood products. By the 1970s, about half of the NHS's supply of factor VIII concentrate used to treat haemophilia was imported, often from high-risk sources. This reliance on imported blood products set the stage for the contaminated blood scandal that would emerge in the following decades. The risks associated with blood transfusions and blood products were well documented and communicated by experts long before the full extent of the crisis was realized. The decision to import and source blood from the US was made by a combination of government health officials and pharmaceutical companies. Despite awareness of the heightened risks, the Department of Health and Social Security and licensing authorities in the UK did not adequately address these concerns. Internal documents reveal that the risks associated with high-risk plasma sources were known but downplayed or ignored in favor of maintaining supply. By the early 1970s, it was well known among health officials that blood and blood products carried a significant risk of transmitting viral hepatitis. This was especially true for hepatitis B, which was recognized for its potential to cause severe chronic disease. Chapter 2. The contaminated blood scandal revealed a troubling picture of systemic failures, where key figures within the government appeared to conspire to protect themselves and minimize liability for the devastating consequences of their actions. John Moore, who served as the Secretary of State for Health and Social Services from 1987 to 1988, played a pivotal role by proposing a £10 million once-and-for-all payment to victims, administered by the Haemophilia Society. This proposal was designed to minimize government intervention and avoid direct responsibility for the damage caused. Moore articulated that this approach was particularly attractive as it aligned with the government's policy of not accepting direct liability for the harm inflicted by contaminated blood products. Other critical figures involved in the scandal include Lord Nigel Crisp, the NHS Chief Executive and Permanent Secretary who oversaw systemic operations during key periods, Lawrence George, an internal auditor who investigated the disappearance and destruction of documents, and Lord Patrick Jenkin, Secretary of State for Health and Social Services during earlier stages of the scandal. Justin Fenwick QC, as legal counsel for the Department of Health, played a crucial role in defending the government against claims brought by victims. Fenwick was deeply involved in providing critical legal advice, representing the government's interests in litigation and negotiating settlements. He focused on minimizing liability and financial exposure for the government, advising on the legal implications of compensation schemes, and handling sensitive document management during litigation. Fenwick's strategic decisions and legal expertise were pivotal in shaping the government's defense strategy and managing the legal fallout from the crisis. Their collective actions and decisions shaped the government's response, which often prioritized limiting legal and financial liability over transparent accountability and comprehensive support for the victims. This approach raises serious moral, legal, and ethical questions about the responsibility and integrity of those in power during one of the most significant healthcare disasters in UK history. The contaminated blood scandal didn't occur in a vacuum. The risks associated with blood transfusions and blood products were well documented and communicated by experts long before the full extent of the crisis was realized. The decision to import and source blood from the US was made by a combination of government health officials and pharmaceutical companies. Despite awareness of the heightened risks, the Department of Health and Social Security and licensing authorities in the UK did not adequately address these concerns. Internal documents reveal that the risks associated with high-risk plasma sources were known but downplayed or ignored in favor of maintaining supply. By the early 1970s, it was well known among health officials that blood and blood products carried a significant risk of transmitting viral hepatitis. This was especially true for hepatitis B, which was recognized for its potential to cause severe chronic disease. In a note from September 1980, Dr. Wolford explicitly stated that non-A, non-B hepatitis could lead to severe chronic illness, underscoring the seriousness of the condition. In May 1975, the World Health Organization urged the development of national blood services based on self-sufficiency and supported voluntary, non-remunerated blood donations. This recommendation was aimed at minimizing the risks associated with commercial blood products, which often came from high-risk populations. In December 1975, Grenada's World in Action aired a two-part documentary titled Blood Money, highlighting the high risk of hepatitis in blood sourced commercially from prisons and paid donors. The documentary revealed that these high-risk sources were significantly more dangerous than domestic donations, with infection rates between 5 to 20 times higher. Warnings about the risks of hepatitis transmission were not limited to public health organizations. Some pharmaceutical companies issued stark warnings on their product labels. For instance, Cutter's Coat product explicitly advised that the presence of the hepatitis virus should be assumed. However, these warnings were often inconsistent and sometimes downplayed the risks, leading to confusion and inadequate precautions. The early 1980s saw increasing concern about a new and deadly virus, AIDS. By mid-1982, the risk that blood transfusions and factor concentrates could transmit AIDS was becoming apparent. Scientific publications and expert testimonies warned of the potential for transmission, but it wasn't until April 1984, when Dr. Robert Gallo identified the virus that causes AIDS, that the medical community fully acknowledged the risk. In response to these emerging threats, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration recommended that blood and plasmapheresis centers inform donors about AIDS and discourage high-risk individuals from donating. Despite these recommendations, many high-risk donations continued, contributing to the spread of the virus through blood products. Despite clear warnings and mounting evidence, the UK government and health authorities were slow to act. The delay in implementing robust screening and safety measures meant that many patients continued to receive contaminated blood products long after the risks were well known. Chapter 3: Failures and Negligence. The systemic failures and negligence at multiple levels, government, healthcare professionals, and pharmaceutical companies, created the perfect storm that led to the contaminated blood scandal. The lack of coordinated response, the prioritization of financial gain over safety, and the failure to inform and protect patients resulted in a healthcare catastrophe that continues to affect thousands of lives. The contaminated blood scandal was not just a series of unfortunate events. It was a systemic failure at multiple levels of governance and healthcare provision. At the heart of this failure were the government and health authorities, primarily the Department of Health and Social Security, DHSS, which was responsible for ensuring the safety of blood products used in the NHS. The DHSS, alongside the Secretaries of State for Health in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, bore the fundamental responsibility for the safety of blood products. However, the inquiry has revealed that these bodies failed to discharge this duty adequately. Despite being aware of the risks associated with blood products, including the transmission of viral hepatitis and later HIV, their responses were often slow, inadequate, and at times misleading. Failures in policy and regulation, lack of a unified national blood service. From the early 1970s, it was well known among government officials that blood products carried a risk of viral hepatitis transmission. Despite this knowledge, significant delays in policy implementation and a lack of unified national blood service exacerbated the crisis. The DHSS's failure to implement effective screening and regulatory measures allowed the continued use of contaminated blood products. The collection of blood from high-risk sources, such as prisons, continued well into the 1980s, despite clear evidence of increased risk of hepatitis B transmission from these sources. This practice was supported by flawed logic and a hands-off approach from the DHSS, which left critical safety decisions to local transfusion directors rather than establishing robust national guidelines. The introduction of direct HIV screening in October 1985 was a significant advancement, yet earlier actions to exclude high-risk donors were impeded by a lack of consensus on costs and benefits. Donor leaflets were never likely to dissuade all high-risk donors. The responsibility for these missed opportunities to screen out some high-risk donors rests with the DHSS and the SHHD, primarily the former, and the blood services. Despite the potential for transmission by blood becoming apparent during 1982, research funding was only requested in April 1984 for a study which would not conclude until November 1986. In the teeth of an impending epidemic, this was far too slow. There were multiple instances of misleading information and negligent actions. For instance, in July 1983, the decision was made not to suspend the continued importation of commercially produced blood products despite known risks. This decision was not revisited, leading to continued exposure of patients to contaminated products. The Department of Health and Social Security was also slow to establish an expert advisory committee on AIDS and failed to take timely action to ensure blood safety. The handling of viral inactivation studies and the reluctance to implement heat-treated products further exemplify this negligence. Furthermore, the contaminated blood scandal is exacerbated by the conflicts of interest among doctors and NHS practitioners who were simultaneously involved in the production and administration of blood products. Their financial relationships with pharmaceutical companies compromise the safety and efficacy of treatments provided to patients, leading to widespread infections and significant public health consequences. The ethical implications of doctors receiving payments from companies whose products they were administering were significant. This practice compromised the objectivity of the medical advice and treatment provided to patients. One of the most egregious failures was the lack of informed consent. Patients were not adequately informed about the risks associated with their treatments. The inquiry found that clinicians often did not communicate the dangers of using concentrates, nor did they offer alternatives. This lack of transparency and failure to provide essential information resulted in patients unknowingly consenting to treatments that had a high risk of infection. Dr. Ian Franklin at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, Dr. Brian Colvin at the London Hospital, and Dr. David Bevan at St. George's Hospital were among the clinicians who continued to use high-risk concentrates despite emerging evidence of the risks. These individuals, along with others, were slow to adapt their treatment practices, significantly increasing the risks to their patients. Pharmaceutical companies, including major players like Highland and Cutter, were heavily implicated in the scandal. These companies prioritized profits over patient safety, continuing to distribute high-risk blood products sourced from paid, high-risk donors. The economic benefits of using cheap plasma from high-risk sources, such as prisons and individuals selling their blood, outweighed the company's consideration for safety. The financial motivations behind the decisions made by these companies were clear. The need to meet high demand for blood products led to cost-cutting measures that compromised safety. Even when the risks were well known, these companies failed to implement safer practices or provide adequate warnings about the dangers of their products. In recent years, there has been significant progress towards holding these companies accountable. The Infected Blood Inquiry has shed light on the extent of the negligence and has recommended compensation for the victims. Chapter 4. The Inquiry and Findings. Between 1970 and 1991, approximately 26,800 people were infected with hepatitis C through blood transfusions. Among these, around 22,000 experienced chronic infections lasting beyond 6 months, with only about 2,700 surviving to the end of 2019. Additionally, around 2,400 to 5,000 individuals with bleeding disorders were infected with hepatitis C, without being co-infected with HIV, though some also contracted hepatitis B and other viruses. It is estimated that 380 children with bleeding disorders were infected with HIV, representing a significant portion of the 1,250 people with bleeding disorders who contracted the virus. Sadly, 3/4 of these individuals have died. According to the inquiry, these pharmaceutical companies are implicated in the contaminated blood scandal. Highland, a major player in the production of blood products, sourced plasma from high-risk donors, including prisoners and individuals who sold their blood. Their actions significantly contributed to the widespread distribution of contaminated blood, prioritizing profits over patient safety. Qatar Laboratories, another key player, similarly sourced plasma from high-risk populations. They were aware of the potential for viral contamination, but chose to continue their practices to meet the high demand for blood products. Qatar's negligence and profit-driven decisions played a crucial role in the dissemination of infected blood products. Baxter International was involved in the production and distribution of blood products that were later found to be contaminated. They failed to implement adequate safety measures and continued to market their products despite the known risks. Alpha Therapeutic sourced plasma from high-risk donors, including paid donors in the United States, without proper screening. Their products were distributed widely, resulting in numerous infections. Immuno also engaged in the production and distribution of blood products from high-risk sources. Despite warnings and evidence of contamination risks, they continued their operations without significant changes to their safety protocols. Collective contribution to the scandal reflects the broader industry trend of ignoring safety concerns for financial gain. In response to years of relentless campaigning by victims and advocacy groups, the Infected Blood Inquiry was established on the 2nd of July 2018. Chaired by Sir Brian Langstaff, the inquiry was tasked with examining the circumstances in which patients treated by the NHS between 1970 and the early 1990s received infected blood and blood products. The formation of the Infected Blood Inquiry marked a significant step towards uncovering the truth and ensuring accountability for one of the gravest public health disasters in UK history. Sir Brian Langstaff, supported by a team of legal professionals, investigators and civil servants, embarked on a comprehensive investigation examining millions of documents and hearing testimonies from numerous witnesses. The inquiry's findings have been critical in highlighting systemic failures and negligence at multiple levels, from government bodies to healthcare professionals and pharmaceutical companies. The inquiry identified numerous systemic failures, including inadequate policy implementation, lack of a unified national blood service, and insufficient regulatory measures. Despite being aware of the risks associated with blood products, the Department of Health and Social Security and other governmental bodies failed to act promptly and effectively. The examination of millions of documents and testimonies revealed a pattern of negligence and misleading actions. For instance, despite early warnings about the risks of hepatitis and HIV transmission, critical decisions to continue using high-risk blood products were made, significantly endangering patients' lives. The inquiry's first interim report, published on the 29th of July 2022, recommended immediate interim payments. The government responded promptly, announcing on the 17th of August 2022 that £100,000 would be paid to infected individuals and bereaved partners. Recent legislative efforts to expedite full compensation for victims. The UK government has accepted the moral responsibility to compensate victims of the infected blood scandal. The compensation is expected to be funded by the government, ensuring that victims receive the financial redress they deserve for the harm they have suffered. In November 2023, MPs voted to expedite compensation for victims of the infected blood scandal. The amendment to the Victims and Prisoners Bill requires ministers to set up a new body to deliver full compensation to victims within 3 months of the bill becoming law. This legislative effort aims to ensure that victims receive the justice they deserve without further delays. The financial implications of compensating the victims of the contaminated blood scandal are significant. Estimates suggest that the compensation scheme might cost the UK government between £5 billion and £10 billion. Some reports have even suggested that the total cost could reach as high as £20 billion. Behind these numbers are individuals and families whose lives have been irrevocably changed. Each statistic represents a person who has suffered, faced stigma, and endured significant physical and emotional pain. The contaminated blood scandal has left an indelible mark on the lives of countless individuals and their families. The personal stories of those infected and their loved ones provide a stark and poignant illustration of the human cost of this tragedy. Stephen Finney was just 2.5 years old when he was first treated with factor VIII concentrates. He contracted hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV from these treatments. The physical, mental, and social impacts of these infections have been devastating. Stephen lives with untreated post-traumatic stress disorder and has struggled with suicidal thoughts, though he has resisted acting on them out of a sense of justice for himself and others affected. Robert Hodgkins was 5 years old when he developed hepatitis B from contaminated blood products. Later, he was also infected with HIV and hepatitis C. The toll on his health and life has been profound. Robert expressed feelings of betrayal by the healthcare system that was supposed to protect him. Elaine Turner was infected with hepatitis C from a blood transfusion after the birth of her second child. She lived unknowingly with the virus for 7 years, fearing she might have passed it on to her family. Her diagnosis came as a shock, bringing with it anxiety and a profound sense of loss. The stigma associated with HIV and hepatitis C has led many victims to live in isolation, fearing judgment and discrimination. This stigma has permeated every aspect of their lives, from employment to personal relationships. David Tompkinson was diagnosed with HIV in 1985 and died 2 years later. His wife Jacqueline described the emotional toll on their family, including the fear of infection and the financial struggle to keep their home while she cared for her dying husband. David's health deteriorated rapidly, and his death left a lasting impact on his family. Many victims have faced significant financial difficulties due to their inability to work and the costs associated with their medical care. The lack of adequate compensation has exacerbated these challenges, leaving many families in dire financial straits. The publication of the report on May 20, 2024, marks a pivotal moment in addressing the injustices of the contaminated blood scandal. By implementing the inquiry's recommendations, ensuring accountability, and taking proactive steps to safeguard patient safety, the UK can prevent such a tragedy from occurring again. The recommendations from the inquiry are extensive and aim to overhaul current practices to ensure patient safety is paramount. Some of the key recommendations are immediate establishment of a comprehensive compensation scheme for victims and their families, acknowledgement of the government's moral responsibility and the need for tangible reparations, implementation of a framework for recording outcomes for recipients of blood components to improve transfusion practices, mandatory blood tests for hepatitis C for patients who had transfusions prior to 1996, enhanced electronic clinical systems to prioritize patient safety, simplification and coordination of external regulation across the UK, introduction of statutory duties for civil servants and ministers to ensure accountability and transparency, increased support and funding for patient advocacy organizations, empowering patient voices in the development of clinical and healthcare policies, formal apology from the government and NHS bodies, acknowledging specific errors and wrongdoings, establishment of a memorial to recognize and remember the victims. Chapter 5. The Conclusion. The Infected Blood Inquiry emphasizes the urgent need for accountability, holding those responsible to account for their roles in this public health catastrophe. It calls for systemic reforms to ensure such a disaster never recurs and to provide justice and compensation for the victims and their families. The inquiry underscores the importance of transparency, ethical practices, and stringent oversight in healthcare to protect patients and maintain public trust. The inquiry also states that the medical professionals and institutions involved in the scandal must be held accountable for their actions, particularly those who failed to provide informed consent or adequately warn patients of the risks associated with blood products, as well as implementation of clear frameworks for decision-making to prevent decision paralysis and ensure timely and effective responses to public health risks, coupled with mandatory reporting and auditing to track the implementation of safety measures and policies. The Infected Blood Inquiry has laid out several recommendations aimed at rectifying past mistakes and safeguarding future blood product usage. Key recommendations include implementation of rigorous screening processes for all blood products to prevent the transmission of infectious diseases, lifetime monitoring for patients diagnosed with conditions like cirrhosis due to infected blood, ensuring they receive ongoing specialized medical care, ongoing review and adaptation of policies to ensure they remain effective and relevant, continuous monitoring and reporting of transfusion outcomes to identify and address any issues promptly, allocation of sufficient resources to support the implementation of new safety measures and patient advocacy programs, adoption of stringent safety protocols for blood products and transfusions. How will this issue evolve in the near future? There is an increasing sentiment advocating for unvaccinated blood donors. This trend underscores the necessity for establishing transparency regarding COVID-19 vaccine blood transfusions to maintain public trust and ensure safety. Concerns have been raised about the potential risks associated with blood from donors who have received COVID-19 vaccines. These concerns highlight the importance of stringent screening protocols and transparent communication with patients regarding the potential risks and benefits of receiving such blood products. Ensuring that patients are fully informed about these potential risks and benefits is essential for maintaining confidence in the healthcare system. The legal implications of this issue are multifaceted. Firstly, healthcare providers have a duty of care to ensure that the blood products they administer are safe and free from harm. This includes implementing rigorous research, screening processes, and disclosing all relevant information to patients. Failure to do so could result in legal liability for medical malpractice or negligence. Secondly, there are regulatory requirements that govern blood donation and transfusion practices. Compliance with these regulations is critical to avoid legal sanctions and to uphold the integrity of the healthcare system. This includes adhering to guidelines set forth by health authorities and ensuring that informed consent is obtained from all patients receiving blood transfusions. Lastly, transparency and patient communication are vital for legal compliance. Patients have the right to be fully informed about their treatment options and any associated risks. This aligns with principles of medical ethics and patient autonomy, which are enshrined in law. Inadequate disclosure or misinformation could lead to legal challenges and undermine patient trust in the healthcare system. The Infected Blood Inquiry has shed light on one of the darkest chapters in NHS history. As we move forward, it is vital to implement the recommendations put forth by the inquiry. These recommendations aim to rectify systemic failures, improve safety protocols, and ensure such a tragedy is never repeated. Holding those responsible accountable is crucial not only for justice, but also for restoring public trust in our healthcare system. The victims and their families have shown immense courage and resilience in their fight for justice. It is our collective responsibility to support them and raise awareness about this issue. Their voices need to be heard and their struggles recognized. For more detailed information on the infected blood inquiry and its findings, visit the official website. We will link the inquiry report in the description. There, you will find comprehensive reports, victim testimonies, and updates on ongoing developments. Ensuring transparency and accountability is not just about addressing past wrongs, but also about setting a precedent for the future. As we navigate new health challenges, it is crucial that the lessons learned from the infected blood inquiry guide our practices and policies. Thank you for watching Audit Oblivion. Your support helps us continue to uncover the truth and advocate for justice. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more investigative stories.